The hospital felt heavier on rainy days. The fluorescent lights seemed colder, the hallways longer, and every sound, the low hum of air vents, the squeak of a gurney's wheels, felt sharper in the damp air. I stood behind the desk in exam room 3, the faint scent of antiseptic and fresh coffee clinging to my lab coat. It was just past 6 p.m., the tail end of visiting hours, and the waiting area outside was full. I adjusted the cuff of my white coat, feeling the familiar snug fit over my wrists. The fabric had always been a kind of armor for me, crisp, pressed, and spotless. Tonight, though, I caught my reflection in the small mirror behind the supply shelf and wondered if the armor was slipping. "Dr. Hartman?" The voice came from the doorway, deep, warm, and younger than I expected. I turned and there he was, Ethan Cole, the new medical assistant I'd been told about in passing during morning rounds. He was taller than most of the residents, at least 6'3", with a presence that seemed to fill the small exam room. His scrubs were hospital-issue navy, but the short sleeves pulled slightly at his shoulders when he moved, and his posture was confident without being cocky. "Richard asked me to bring you the patient charts for tonight's shift," he said, stepping inside. His eyes, a bright clear green, met mine without hesitation. "Thank you, Ethan," I said, reaching for the folder. As he handed it over, our fingers brushed, barely, but enough for me to notice how warm his skin was. I pretended not to. He didn't move away immediately. "You've got a full list tonight," he said, glancing at the top chart. "It's going to be a long one." "Long is fine," I replied, flipping open the first page. "Keeps me focused." His lips curved into the faintest smile. "Guess I'll be here to keep you company, then." There was no arrogance in his tone, but there was something else. An ease, a quiet confidence. I was used to colleagues who spoke with either deference or formality. This was different. "How long have you been here?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the chart. 2 weeks, he said. Before that, I was doing a clinical rotation in Portland. Thought I'd try somewhere smaller for a change. "Smaller?" I gave him a quick glance. "Riverside Hospital isn't exactly small." He smiled again. "Smaller than Portland and more personal, maybe." I didn't ask what he meant. The phone rang at the nurse's station, breaking the moment. He excused himself to answer it, his steps unhurried. By 9 o'clock, the waiting area had emptied a little. The rhythm of night shift had settled in. Fewer patients, but cases that required more time. I was jotting notes into the system when Ethan appeared again, this time with 2 paper cups. "Thought you could use this," he said, setting one beside my laptop. The steam curled upward, rich and sharp. "How did you know I take it black?" He shrugged. "Lucky guess." I took a sip, letting the heat sink into me. "Thank you." He leaned a hip against the counter, watching me type. "So, how long have you been doing nights?" "Too long," I said without looking up. "Because you like it? Or because someone has to?" I met his gaze. "Why are you asking?" He tilted his head slightly. "Just wondering what keeps you here after dark, Dr. Hartman." The way he said my name, slow even, felt deliberate. I turned back to my notes. "Some of us work better when it's quiet." "Quiet can be nice," he said, "but it can also get lonely." My fingers paused over the keyboard. "Is that your way of saying you're bored already?" His grin deepened. "Not bored, just making conversation." The rain picked up after midnight. I could hear it ticking softly against the tall windows of the hallway as I moved from room to room. Ethan trailed a few steps behind, carrying supplies, updating charts without being asked. In one of the empty corridors, we passed a vending machine. The soft glow of its light fell across his face as he stopped to punch in a code for a snack. "You always this quiet on first nights?" I asked, pausing beside him. He glanced at me sideways. "Not always, just reading the room." "Reading me, you mean?" His eyes met mine, holding them. "Maybe." The package dropped into the bin, breaking the moment. He tore it open, handed me a small packet without a word. By 3 a.m., the hospital had gone still. No footsteps in the hall, no distant call buttons, just the rain and the faint hum of the vending machine behind us. I was at the nurse's station finishing a chart when I felt his presence beside me, close enough that I could sense the warmth of his shoulder. "You've got that look again," he said quietly. "What look?" "Like your mind's somewhere else." I straightened, tucking my pen into my coat pocket. "You shouldn't make assumptions about your supervisor." He didn't back away. "I wasn't assuming, just noticing. I told myself it was harmless. It was just a night shift, and he was just a new assistant. But when I left at sunrise and saw him leaning casually against the doorframe, watching me with that same unflinching gaze, I knew this wasn't going to stay simple. The hospital after 8 in the evening is a different world. No sun streaming through the atrium glass, no chatter from visitors, just the low hum of machines and the occasional rattle of a gurney's wheels over tile. That's when Ethan came alive. It wasn't just that he seemed more relaxed without the constant oversight of day shift supervisors. It was something else, something in the way his eyes lingered longer, the way his voice dipped just enough to make words feel personal. Tonight we were on triage duty together. I was charting a patient with a stubborn ear infection when I heard his voice from behind. "Dr. Hartman," he said, almost like he'd been standing there for a while, waiting for me to notice. "Yes?" I didn't look up immediately. My fingers were still moving across the keyboard. "You've been here since 7 this morning. When's the last time you ate something that wasn't coffee?" I turned then. His smile wasn't just friendly, it was searching, like he wanted to see if I'd deflect or answer honestly. I tried to deflect. "You're assuming coffee isn't a food group," he chuckled, leaning one shoulder against the doorway, arms crossed over his scrub top. "Guess I'll have to change that." Before I could ask what he meant, he pulled a paper bag from behind his back. "Turkey sandwich. And before you worry, I already checked. You're not allergic to anything in it." The thought that he'd asked around, or noticed, made my stomach twist in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. I accepted it, feeling our fingers brush briefly in the handoff. That tiny contact felt sharper than it should have. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I know," he replied, eyes holding mine, "but I wanted to." The rest of the shift carried that charge, an undercurrent I could feel even when we weren't in the same room. Around 10:30, an elderly man came in with chest pain. Ethan and I worked side by side, him placing leads for the EKG, me ordering tests and explaining the plan. We moved in sync, no wasted motion, no clipped tones, and every so often I caught him glancing at me, not the way some younger staff look at a senior physician, but like we were equals, co-conspirators. At midnight, the ER quieted again. I was in the supply room reaching for a box of gloves on the top shelf when I felt someone behind me. Ethan's voice was low. "Need a hand?" Before I could answer, he stepped close enough that his chest nearly brushed my back, his arm lifting beside mine to take the box down. The smell of clean soap and faint aftershave reached me first, then the realization of how near we were. "Thanks," I managed, my voice a little softer than I intended. His gaze lingered on my face for half a second too long, then he smiled, slow like he knew something, and walked out with the box in his hand. By the time my shift ended, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted tonight. It wasn't about the sandwich, or the way his hand brushed mine, or even the way he looked at me in that cramped supply room. It was the quiet between those moments, the unspoken thing hanging in the air, waiting, and I knew deep down that I was going to let it happen. 2 nights later, the ER was chaos. It started with a multi-car accident just after sundown, and for 4 straight hours, I was moving, suturing, ordering imaging, stabilizing vitals. My hair stuck to the back of my neck, my palms smelled faintly of antiseptic, and my coffee sat untouched on the counter. Ethan was everywhere. I'd turn and he'd already be there, holding the chart I needed, swapping out my gloves, pressing gauze into my hand before I even asked. We didn't talk much during the rush. It was all quick instructions and curt nods, but the eye contact was different. Not just acknowledgement, recognition. By 1:15 a.m., the wave had passed, the trauma bays were quiet again, and the adrenaline began to drain from my system. I was scribbling final notes on a discharge form when I felt a water bottle press lightly into my palm. "Drink," Ethan said. His voice wasn't a request. It was something closer to concern. I looked up, meeting his eyes. His hair was damp from a quick rinse at the sink, his scrub top wrinkled, sleeves pushed to his elbows. "Thanks," I said, taking a sip. My throat ached from hours of clipped commands. He didn't move away. Instead, he leaned against the counter beside me, arms folded, watching me like I was part of a puzzle he was starting to solve. "You do this thing," he said after a moment. I frowned. "What thing?" "When you're in the middle of a crisis, you get this look in your eyes, like nothing can touch you, but then, as soon as it's over, it's like you're holding your breath." The words slid into me in a way I wasn't ready for. "You notice too much," I muttered. "Only the things worth noticing." At 2:05 a.m., the last patient was discharged, and the charge nurse sent us both to rest before morning rounds. The staff lounge was dim, the vending machine humming in the corner. I collapsed into the couch, kicked off my shoes, and let my head rest back. I didn't even hear him come in until the cushion shifted beside me. "You're supposed to be sleeping," I murmured without opening my eyes. "I'm not tired," he said. When I looked at him, his face was calm, but his knee bounced slightly, like there was something unspoken pressing at him. "Then why are you here?" I asked. He held my gaze for a long beat. "Because you are." Something in my chest tightened. I turned away first, but the awareness between us didn't go anywhere. It sat there in the quiet, breathing with us, waiting for its moment. When I finally stood to leave, his voice stopped me. "Clara," he said, my name soft but deliberate. I turned, hand on the doorframe. "I'm not going to pretend I don't feel this," he said, "but I'll wait until you stop pretending you don't, too." For a second I couldn't move. My pulse thundered in my ears. And then I walked out, telling myself it was because I didn't want to answer. But the truth was, I already had. For the next week, Ethan kept his word. He didn't push, didn't linger too long, didn't cross the line. But I felt him, like a low hum in the room that followed me everywhere. When I was updating a patient's chart, he'd pass behind me, close enough that I caught the faint scent of cedar soap. When I reached for the top shelf in the supply closet, his hand would appear beside mine, steadying the box before it tipped. When we stood at opposite ends of a gurney, I could feel his eyes on me, not in a way that demanded, but in a way that asked. One night, just past midnight, the ER slowed to a near standstill, the kind of lull that feels fragile, like it could break at any moment. I was restocking sutures in the treatment room when I heard the door push open. Ethan stepped in, his ID badge swaying on its lanyard. "Need help?" he asked. I shook my head. "I've got it." He didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against the counter, hands in his pockets, watching me slide sterile packs into neat rows. "You organize everything," he said after a moment. "Someone has to." "No, I mean, you need to. You line things up like it makes the chaos less real," I finished for him. His mouth curved slightly. "Yeah, exactly that." I kept my focus on the sutures, but I could feel him stepping closer. His voice dropped just enough that I had to tilt my head toward him to hear. "Does it work?" I swallowed. "Sometimes." He was close now, but not touching. I could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his gaze lingered at the curve of my cheek before meeting my eyes. "It's not just the patients you're trying to keep safe, is it?" he said quietly. Something in me tensed. Reflex, habit, history. "Don't," I said, a little sharper than I meant. "I'm not judging," he replied, his tone steady. "I'm just noticing." Before I could answer, a voice called from the hall. Triage needed an extra set of hands. I brushed past him, my shoulder grazing his arm, and forced myself not to look back. But the image stayed with me all night, him standing there in the quiet room, seeing more than I wanted him to. By Friday, it got harder to pretend I didn't feel it too. We were reviewing labs at the nurse's station when I caught him watching me again. This time I didn't look away right away. The air between us shifted, something warmer, heavier. A call came in before either of us could say anything, but the moment lodged itself under my skin like a splinter, and deep down I knew I wasn't pulling away anymore. It happened on a Tuesday night, the kind where fatigue wraps around you like a damp blanket. The ER was running on fumes, 2 traumas in less than an hour, a combative drunk in Bay 3, and a worried mother clutching her feverish toddler in the waiting area. Everyone was stretched thin. I was in the med supply room scanning shelves for IV fluids when Ethan slipped in behind me. "Need a hand?" I almost said no, but the truth was I was too tired to argue. "Yeah," I murmured. He stepped close, reaching past me to grab a case from the top shelf. His shirt brushed my shoulder, warm through the thin fabric of my scrubs. When he lowered the box, he didn't move away. "You okay?" he asked. I'm fine. "You look like you've been running on 4 hours of sleep for 3 days straight." 5, I corrected without thinking. His lips twitched, half amusement, half concern. "You can't keep doing that." I tried to sidestep him, but his hand came up, not touching me, just resting against the shelf beside my shoulder, effectively caging me in. "Clara." The way he said my name, low, steady, made my pulse skip. I should have told him to move, should have walked right out of that room, but I didn't. Instead, I looked up at him, and for a moment, I let it happen. Let him see all the exhaustion, the loneliness, the craving for something I hadn't let myself want in a long time. His gaze searched mine, and I felt the shift, the moment the line blurred. "I'm not trying to make trouble for you," he said quietly. "I know. He stopped, jaw tightening, as if he was holding something back. Outside, I could hear the intercom paging a doctor, but in here, time slowed to a crawl. When he finally spoke again, it was barely above a whisper. "You make it harder to keep my head straight." Something inside me cracked, not all the way, but enough for the water to start leaking through. Before I could respond, the door pushed open and another nurse rushed in for supplies. Ethan stepped back immediately, the moment folding into nothing. But it wasn't nothing. We both knew it. That night, when I finally clocked out, I found him waiting by the staff exit. "Need a ride?" he asked. "I've got my car." He nodded, but didn't move right away. "Get some sleep, Clara." I should have said goodnight and walked to my car, but I stood there too long, watching him head to his truck, the sound of his boots on wet pavement echoing in my chest. And deep down, I knew the dam wouldn't hold much longer. 2 nights later, the hospital was a different kind of chaotic, steady but not frantic. Enough lulls between calls for the exhaustion to sink its teeth in. I'd been charting at the nurse's station when Ethan passed by, his shoulder brushing mine, not hard, not even deliberate, but enough to pull my attention. He paused. "Coffee?" I started to say no. Coffee at midnight was reckless, and time alone with him was more dangerous than caffeine. But something in me, something tired of restraint, said, "Why not?" We ended up in the break room, fluorescent lights humming, the air smelling faintly of burnt toast from someone's forgotten snack. He poured us both a cup. "You take sugar?" "No, just black." "Figures," he said with a small smile, handing me the mug. "Straight to the point." I sipped, letting the heat bloom in my chest. For a while, we talked about nothing. Shift schedules, the stubborn vending machine, a patient who'd thanked him with a drawing of a stick figure in a cape. But under the small talk, something else hummed, steady and low. When I stood to rinse my cup, he moved at the same time, and suddenly he was close, closer than the break room really allowed. My hip brushed his. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, the faint scent of soap and whatever cologne he wore. "You should let yourself breathe once in a while," he said softly. This is me breathing. He gave me a look, half amused, half aching. I turned to the sink, rinsing the mug, but my hands felt clumsy. His presence was a weight I couldn't ignore. When I turned back, his hand was braced on the counter beside me, not touching, but close enough that the air between us felt charged, ready to spark. I looked up, meaning to break it, to step away before anyone walked in. Instead, I caught the way his gaze dropped, not to my body, not in a way that felt crude, but to my mouth, like he was fighting something hard. Ethan. Yeah? His voice was rougher now. I should have said we couldn't do this. I should have reminded him of the rules, the gossip, the risk, but my throat tightened, and what came out instead was barely a whisper. Never mind. A call over the intercom saved us. Trauma incoming. 5 minutes. He stepped back, the moment shattering like glass hitting tile. But as we moved toward the ER doors, I caught his hand brushing mine, so light it could have been an accident. Except it wasn't. That night when I went home, I could still feel that fleeting contact like a brand on my skin, and I realized something dangerous. It wasn't just the dam that was cracking. I was starting to want it to break. 3 shifts later, the rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. The ER smelled like damp coats and antiseptic, and every patient who came through the doors seemed to carry the weather in with them. We were running light on staff. Ethan and I ended up paired for most of the night. Triage, transfers, quick consults. Every time I passed him in the hallway, his hand would brush my back, just enough to guide me. It was subtle, harmless to anyone watching, but my pulse didn't get the memo. It was almost 3 a.m. when the waiting room went quiet, a rare, thin slice of calm. I'd gone into the supply closet to grab more saline bags, not thinking twice. The door clicked shut behind me. I turned, and there he was. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there like he wasn't sure if this was a bad idea or the only idea he had left. Forgot the gauze, he said finally, but he didn't move toward it. I stepped back to make space, but the closet was too small for real distance. The air between us seemed to shrink with every second. You've been avoiding me, he said quietly. I've been working. That's not what I mean. His eyes searched mine, and it felt like being read too closely, like he could see every excuse I'd been clinging to. I can't, I started, but the words caught. Clara, he said, my name landing somewhere deep in my chest. If you tell me to walk out right now, I will. But if you don't, the rest of his sentence dissolved in the silence. I should have told him to go. I should have reminded him and myself of all the reasons this was reckless, messy, wrong. Instead, I stayed still, and that was enough for him to take a step closer. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my face. His knuckles grazed my cheek, and that small touch unraveled something I'd been holding tight for weeks. When his mouth met mine, it wasn't rushed. It was deliberate, measured, like we both knew we'd been heading here since the night in the break room. The kiss deepened, slow and searching. One of his hands slid to the back of my neck, the other anchoring at my waist. I felt my body lean in, my resolve breaking in the quietest, most willing way. The supply closet smelled faintly of alcohol wipes and cotton, but all I could breathe in was him, warm, steady, grounding in a way that made me feel more unsteady than ever. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine. This is trouble, I murmured. Yeah, he said, his breath still uneven, but I'm already in it. We didn't speak as we left the closet. The hallway was empty, the world outside still drowning in rain, and somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't a moment we could just tuck away and forget. It was the start of something neither of us was ready to stop. The morning after the kiss, I woke up with the weight of it still pressed against my skin. Not the physical pressure, but the memory. Warm, slow, dangerously sweet. By the time I walked into the hospital that night, I'd rehearsed 100 ways to act normal. I'd settled on the simplest one: avoidance. Ethan didn't make it easy. I spotted him leaning over the nurse's station, chart in hand, talking to one of the residents. His scrubs were the same navy blue as always, but my eyes caught on the curve of his mouth mid-smile. That same mouth had been on mine less than 24 hours ago. He looked up at me, and it was over. My plan, my distance, all of it. We didn't talk about it during shift change or during the first wave of patients. It was as if we'd signed an unspoken contract to pretend nothing had happened. But every brush of his hand when he passed me a file, every low word he murmured over my shoulder, pulled me back to that cramped closet. Around midnight, the ER was running on autopilot, patients stabilized, the usual hum of machines filling the air. I slipped into the break room for coffee, telling myself it was just to stay awake. The door clicked shut, and he was already there. "Clara," he said, his tone softer than it should have been for a room with 4 walls and no one else inside. I kept my eyes on the coffee machine. "We can't—" "I know." His voice was steady, but there was a tightness under it. "I've been telling myself the same thing." Silence stretched. The machine sputtered, filling the small space with the smell of burnt roast. When I finally looked up, his gaze locked on mine, steady and unreadable. "You don't regret it," he said. Not a question, not quite a statement. "I can't afford to," I murmured, and that was the truth. Regret would mean I had the luxury of undoing it. His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he'd step closer. Instead, he reached past me, took a paper cup from the shelf, and filled it halfway. His fingers brushed mine as he handed it over. "Stay warm," he said, and left before I could answer. Back at the nurse's station, the air felt thicker somehow, as if everyone else could sense a change but couldn't name it. I worked through vitals and charts with mechanical precision, all while my pulse betrayed me. Avoidance wasn't going to work. Not when the pull between us was growing stronger each night we tried to ignore it. When the clock hit 6 a.m., I stepped outside into the early light. The rain had stopped, but the pavement still glistened, reflecting the hospital's harsh white glow. Behind me, the door swung open. I didn't have to turn to know it was him. "We'll talk," Ethan said quietly. "About what?" I asked, though we both knew. He didn't answer. He just gave me that same steady look from the closet, the one that said this wasn't over. And in my chest, something I'd tried to bury shifted and began to rise again. 3 days passed. 3 shifts where we'd managed to orbit each other without colliding, passing in hallways, exchanging patient notes, keeping everything crisp, professional. But the more we held back, the more something inside me strained against the leash. It was the 4th night that did it. A storm had rolled in, thick sheets of rain hammering the hospital windows. The ER was quiet but tense, the kind of quiet that felt like it wouldn't last. I was charting vitals at the end of the hall when a trauma call came in. Ethan and I moved without thinking, meeting at the ambulance bay doors. The patient was a teenager with a deep head wound from a car accident, blood everywhere, panic in his eyes. We worked in sync, my hands pressing gauze, his voice steady as he ordered suction and checked pupils. For 15 minutes there was no us, no history, just 2 people holding someone's life together. When the boy was stable and wheeled upstairs, I realized my hands were shaking. Ethan noticed too. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said, but my voice was thinner than I liked. Without asking, he reached out and closed his hand over mine. Warm, solid. It wasn't about the kiss. It wasn't even about attraction in that moment. It was about the way he saw me, like he could read the weight I carried and refused to let me carry it alone. The sound of a monitor beeped somewhere behind us, snapping the thread. I pulled my hand back. "We can't keep doing this." "I know," he said, but his eyes didn't match his voice. And yet here we are. Later in the locker room, I stayed late under the pretense of reorganizing my bag. I heard footsteps before I saw him. He stopped a few feet away. "We keep pretending, Clara," he said quietly. "But it's only getting harder." "That's exactly why we have to stop," I whispered. He took a step closer, the air between us charged, almost humming. "Tell me you don't think about it," he said. "Tell me you don't replay it in your head when you're trying to sleep." I didn't answer. That was all the answer he needed. For a moment, the storm outside roared louder, rattling the narrow window. His gaze was steady, searching my face for something I didn't want to admit. I could have walked away. I could have shut the door, locked it, and let the silence swallow us whole. Instead, I just stood there, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that one small choice could tilt us past the point of return. "Ethan," I breathed, not as a warning, but almost like a question. His reply was a slow exhale, his voice low and rough. "We're already there." The locker room smelled faintly of rain-soaked coats and antiseptic. Somewhere down the hall a floor buffer hummed, its sound a far-off mechanical lullaby. We stood in the middle of it all, two people who'd spent weeks telling themselves they had control. Ethan moved first, closing the distance between us in a slow, deliberate step, like he was giving me every second to stop him. I didn't. His hand lifted, fingers brushing my jaw. Not a grab, not a demand, just contact, warm and impossibly steady. "You don't have to be afraid of wanting something," he said quietly, "even if it's me." I should have told him all the reasons this was wrong. Instead, my eyes closed, and I leaned barely into his touch. The storm outside deepened, wind rattling the vent above us. It felt like the building itself was holding its breath. His mouth found mine in a kiss that wasn't hurried or clumsy, but slow and searching, like he'd been holding it in for far too long and now needed to map every inch of it. I let him. My hands, almost without permission, slid up into his hair. It was softer than I expected, familiar in a way that made my chest ache. We didn't rush. Every movement felt like it carried its own gravity, his palm against the small of my back, my breath catching as he deepened the kiss, the quiet sound he made when I pulled him closer. It was less about heat and more about inevitability. We'd been standing at the edge for weeks, and now finally we'd stepped off. When we broke apart, neither of us moved away. His forehead rested against mine. Our breaths mingled in the narrow space between us. "This doesn't change everything," I whispered, though it sounded like I was trying to convince myself. "It changes something," he murmured back. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, I realized there was no going back to before. Not when I could still feel the echo of him in my pulse, not when his presence had shifted from a dangerous temptation into something I craved. We left the locker room separately, but the line was gone, and we both knew it. The next night, the hospital felt different, not because of the patients, or the weather, or the endless fluorescent hum, but because of us. Every hallway, every glance, every word exchanged between charts and IV checks carried a weight I couldn't disguise. At the nurse's station, Ethan leaned over to point at a set of vitals on my clipboard. His arm brushed mine. Just that. But it was enough to send a flash of warmth down my spine that I tried to smother with a deep breath. "You need to recheck room 212, he said, voice low. I nodded, forcing myself to focus on the paper instead of the faint scent of cedar soap clinging to him. We moved through the night like two people in a dance only we knew, passing in narrow corridors, catching each other's eyes across the ER, our conversations clipped but loaded with unspoken memory from the locker room. I was careful, so careful, but the charge between us was too alive to disappear completely. Near 2 a.m. in the supply closet, it broke. I'd been restocking saline bags when the door opened, and Ethan slipped inside. The space was barely big enough for one person. Two meant his shoulder pressed against mine, his breath brushing my temple. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered. His lips twitched in a humorless smile. "We haven't done anything tonight." The truth in that made my chest ache. He reached past me for a box on the shelf, his arm sliding against my side. The warmth, the closeness, it was all deliberate and reckless. I swallowed hard. Someone's going to notice. His eyes met mine in the dim light. Let them. It was the first time he'd said it without hesitation, and it landed in me like a stone in water, ripples spreading fast, impossible to stop. When he left, I stayed in the closet for a full minute, clutching a clipboard I didn't remember picking up, trying to steady my breath. For the rest of the shift, every time our paths crossed, there was no pretending anymore. We weren't just two people working the night shift. We were something else now, something fragile, dangerous, and impossible to put back in its box. The house felt heavier that night, as if the rain pressing against the windows was seeping into its bones. Every sound seemed sharper, the slow drip from the eaves, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of wind curling around the corners. I sat at the kitchen table with my hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold long ago. I wasn't drinking, I wasn't even thinking straight. My mind kept circling back to the way Micah had looked at me upstairs, like he'd been carrying something for years, and had finally decided I should see the weight of it. I heard him pacing above me. 3 steps, pause, 3 more, until the boards creaked near the stairs. His footsteps came down slow, deliberate, like each one brought him closer to something he wasn't ready to face. When he appeared in the doorway, I almost didn't recognize him. His shirt clung damp to his shoulders, his hair mussed in a way that told me he'd been standing outside in the rain, probably trying to gather the courage to walk back in. His eyes found mine, but only for a heartbeat before they slid away. "You didn't have to wait up," he said quietly, his voice rough at the edges. "I wasn't waiting," I answered, though my fingers tightened around the mug. He crossed the kitchen, the sound of his boots on the worn wood floor filling the space between us. When he stopped beside me, I could smell the faint mix of rain and cedar on him. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid he could hear it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The clock ticked on the wall, slow and unbothered, while the air between us grew charged with something unspoken. "Claire!" His voice was softer now, like he was testing how my name felt in his mouth. "If I tell you the truth, you won't look at me the same." I held his gaze, even though it ached to. Maybe I already don't. His jaw tightened, a shadow crossing his face. "Guessing isn't knowing," he said, almost to himself. I wanted to tell him I wasn't afraid of knowing, that the not knowing was worse, that it left too much room for imagining, for building stories that might be darker than the truth. But my tongue felt heavy, and the words stayed locked inside me. He leaned his hands on the table, close enough that his fingers brushed mine. It was the lightest touch, almost nothing, but it sent a jolt through me. For a second, I thought he'd pull away. He didn't. Instead, he let out a slow breath and looked at me in a way that made the rest of the kitchen dissolve. I didn't see the walls or the rain or the clock. I only saw him, raw, unguarded, and so close that if I reached out, the night would change forever. The thunder rolled somewhere far in the mountains, low and steady, and I knew it wasn't the storm outside that we had to fear. It was this. It was us. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I just lay there, listening to the rain, feeling every second stretch out until the first pale light of morning crept across the floor. By the time Thursday night came, the walls of the hospital felt like they were closing in, not because of the patients or the chaos, but because of the pressure building between us, silent and relentless. Every glance was heavier. Every brush of his hand against mine lingered just a fraction too long. It was like we were both standing at the edge of something neither of us had the courage or sense to step away from. It was just past midnight when I found him in the staff lounge, sitting alone at the table with his head in his hands. A half-empty coffee sat in front of him, steam curling into the dim air. "You okay?" I asked, keeping my voice soft. He lifted his head slowly. His eyes were shadowed, like he hadn't slept in days. "Not really," he said. "It's getting harder. Pretending." I shut the door behind me before I even thought about it. "What happened?" He leaned back in his chair, the light catching the tired lines at the corners of his mouth. I almost called you earlier, not here, at home, just to hear your voice. That admission hit me deep, pulling something loose inside. I moved toward him without realizing it, my fingers brushing the back of his hand. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, his hand turned, palm up, capturing mine. "We shouldn't," I started, but my voice caught when his thumb slid slowly along the curve of my wrist. "Tell me to stop," he said, but I didn't. The silence between us broke like glass. I leaned in just enough to feel his breath warm against my cheek, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. "This is going to hurt," I whispered. "I know." His voice was steady. "But I don't care anymore." And then he kissed me, slow at first, like testing the shape of something fragile. But it deepened, grew hungrier, all the weeks of holding back unraveling in seconds. By the time we pulled apart, my hands were tangled in his hair, his breath unsteady against my lips. We stayed there for a moment, our foreheads pressed together, neither ready to let go. But somewhere down the hall, a monitor alarm started shrilling. The real world snapped back. We straightened, smoothed our scrubs, and walked out like nothing had happened, except everything had. The next morning, everything felt off. Not wrong, just fragile. We passed each other in the hallway like strangers. No smiles, no glances held too long. If anyone noticed, they'd just think we were tired. But I could still feel last night on my skin like it had etched itself there under the surface. It started in radiology. I'd just dropped off a chart when one of the nurses, Carla, leaned against the counter with that look. "You and Dr. Weston seem close lately." My hand tightened on the folder. "We work the same shifts, that's all." She smiled, slow and knowing. "Uh-huh, sure." Her tone was teasing, but her eyes were sharp. By lunch, I'd caught 2 more sideways looks. By the end of the shift, I overheard someone in the lounge whisper my name and his in the same sentence. I wanted to laugh it off, pretend it didn't matter, but my stomach was a knot, because rumors here didn't stay rumors. They spread, they grew teeth, and sooner or later they reached the wrong ears. That night I found him again, same lounge, same half-empty coffee. "They're talking," I said. He didn't even look surprised. They were always going to talk. What if... I stopped because the words felt heavy. What if this costs us our jobs? His gaze lifted to mine, steady, unflinching. "Then we figure it out. Together." I wanted to believe him. But together in here was dangerous. Together meant there was no walking it back. Still, the thought of going back to how things were felt like trying to breathe underwater. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the vending machine. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing mine, not holding, just enough to make my pulse spike. "They can talk all they want," he said. "I'm not letting them decide this for us." By the time I left that night, I knew something had shifted again. The rumors weren't the end. They were the beginning of whatever came next, and whatever that was. We couldn't hide from it much longer. The call came at 2:17 a.m. I was halfway through paperwork when the intercom buzzed. "Dr. Weston, please report to Admin Office 3 immediately." My chest tightened. They never called doctors to administration in the middle of a shift unless something was wrong, very wrong. When I reached the hallway, he was already there, leaning against the wall, hands in his pockets, jaw tight. "They called you too?" I asked. He nodded once. His eyes flicked toward the closed door, and for a second I saw something I'd never seen on him before. Not fear, resignation. Inside, the director was waiting with a folder on the desk. It was thick, too thick. She didn't waste time. "We've received multiple reports of inappropriate conduct between the 2 of you." My stomach dropped. The words were clinical, stripped of nuance, but they still landed like a punch. "We've done nothing that compromises patient care," he said evenly. "That may be," she replied, "but perception matters. And right now, The perception is complicated. She used the word like it was a diagnosis, something to be treated, cut out before it spread. They gave us the choice, separate shifts effective immediately, or one of us could transfer to another hospital in the network. The room felt colder, like we were standing on opposite cliffs, the space between us widening with every breath. "I'll go," he said, no hesitation. I shook my head hard. "No, you built your life here. I'm not letting you—" He cut me off with a quiet, steady, "This isn't about the hospital anymore." When we left the office, the hallway was empty. We walked in silence until we reached the stairwell. There, he stopped, looked at me like he was memorizing every line of my face. "You told me once you didn't want to breathe underwater anymore," he said. "Neither do I." The stairwell light flickered, and for a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just us. No walls, no rumors, no rules left to follow. He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the heat of him, smell the faint trace of coffee and sleepless nights. His hand cupped my jaw, thumb brushing my cheek, and then he kissed me. It wasn't frantic this time. It was slow, certain, the kind of kiss that didn't ask for permission because the answer had already been lived 100 times in unspoken moments. When we pulled back, there was no going back. By the end of the week, his resignation was in. By the end of the month, I was packing boxes. We didn't know where we were going yet, only that it would be away from here. People say hospitals are full of stories that never leave their walls. Ours did, and for the first time in years I could breathe.